Class. This is our lecture covering ethics and psychological research that relates to Chapter 4 in your book. Now, throughout this chapter, there are references to Stanley Milgram's famous study from 1965 on obedience. We're going to talk about this article in great detail in a subsequent lecture as one of our four important articles in the history of psychology. So I'm going to go over some of the details today, but keep in mind that we'll be expanding upon it in a lot of more detail as time goes on. But essentially, they're going to use the Milgram article as an example of studies that affected people's attention towards ethics and psychological research. It's perhaps the most famous study in psychology because of its sort of intensity of the subject that was being studied, and because the results were so shocking to a lot of people. It was widely disseminated outside of the world of psychology. It was discussed in the popular culture in a lot of detail, and so it became very groundbreaking in a lot of ways. So that Milgram research ultimately had a really profound influence on the way that psychologists think about research ethics and how we also understand people's obedience to authority. Every psychologist needs to consider how to practice our discipline ethically. Whether this practice involves clinical care with people who are having mental health issues, research to learn about human behavior, or some mixture of both. So there are parallel worlds of ethics in psychology, including the clinical world, which we're not going to get into great detail about in this course, but we are going to talk quite a bit about how it relates to conducting research. Paramount of concern at all times should be the emotional needs of the human participants and how they respond to the actions that we take as researchers. Researchers in developing their procedures need to always consider that the individuals deserve respect for their well-being and consideration. So I want to talk a little bit about Milgram's study of obedience from 1963, and then we'll go on to talk about it in much more detail in the next lecture. But these are a few high points that I want you to be aware of just for the context of this chapter on ethics. Basically, it was conducted in 63, and in the original study there were 40 participants, and they were told that they were going to participate in an experiment that was going to investigate the relationship between punishment and memory and how it relates to learning. When the people were brought in to participate in the study, they were there with another person, and they were told that this was another participant, and then they were randomly assigned to either be the teacher or the learner. Now, what is sort of important about this study, the thing that creates some ethical issues, is that other participant was not actually a participant. That other participant was what's called a confederate. So that was someone who had been enlisted with the experimenter, who was basically playing a role and was not actually a participant at all. The random assignment was actually fixed so that the person who was the real participant always ended up in the teacher, quote unquote, teacher role, the person who would eventually, they would find out, be administering shocks. So the idea is that the participant and the learner, the teacher and the learner, are in separate rooms with a wall separating them. So they don't actually see the person receiving the quote unquote shocks that are not real. But the idea is that they're going to be learning a list of paired words. So when you hear one word, you're supposed to respond with the other. And then the participant, the teacher in this case, is supposed to ask the student, remember who is a confederate, to remember that second word. If they give an incorrect answer, they're then instructed by the experimenter to administer an electric shock to that person. And the shock level increases with each incorrect answer. Now, the individuals who were participants were told that these shocks were not dangerous, but that they were extremely painful as they reached that more severe range. And in order to make this more believable, the quote-unquote learner, the confederate on the other side of the wall, was really trained to deliver a performance that they were actually in pain and to protest as the fake shocks increase in intensity. And we'll go into all the really nitty-gritty details of this in the next lecture. But what was really shocking about this study, the reason why it was so groundbreaking, was that 25 of the 40, 62.5% of the participants, continued to comply with the experimenter and administered the most extreme shock level. Now remember that in fact they're not administering any shock at all. It's completely fake. It's really meant to give the impression though that you are administering shock. And that extreme shock level was accompanied by a performance by the confederate that indicated that you had genuinely hurt, potentially killed this person in the process. What was also interesting about Milgram's study was that he went ahead and did some initial survey research before conducting the experiment. Now, this study was conducted at Yale, so in New Haven, Connecticut. And he went and he took surveys from various different groups. He took surveys from Yale undergraduate students, he took them from people in the community, and he took them from professors in the school. But essentially, what people, when they were asked in advance, how far will people go in terms of administering these potentially severe shocks, what they thought was that the average, the mean was 9.35. They'd be willing to give a quote unquote strong shock. However, the actual maximum shock administered in the study on average was 24.53, which is considered extreme intensity. We're going to go into all of the nuts and bolts of this in a moment, but I want you to essentially understand the very basics of this, which is you have a participant who comes in who is essentially deceived. And that participant is deceived in several ways. First and foremost, they think they're being randomly assigned to one role or the other. That's actually not the case. The person they believe is another participant is in fact a Confederate who's working with the researcher. And then they're deceived in the sense that they're actually administering a shock when in fact no shock is being delivered. What was shocking again about the outcome was how far people were willing to go. So we need to understand Milgram's experiment in context. Keep in mind this research is being conducted, not too many years after the end of World War II. And the scale and the scope of World War II, the amount of death and carnage that was a part of that war was really beyond anything people had ever seen before in the world. And it was shattering to our sense of what it means to be human beings. It also drew into really sharp contrast how we like to think about ourselves as human beings and what we're actually capable of under these circumstances. So, ultimately the sort of example that's always pointed to, of course, is the Holocaust, but just the scale of the war in general was staggering. The Nuremberg war crime trials that were conducted in Germany soon after World War II were really an attempt to understand how the Germans had done the things they had done during the war. Now, I don't want to imply that the Germans were the only people that committed war crimes during World War II. That's certainly not the case. But as the instigators of the war and as the eventual losers of the war, they were examined in greater detail in terms of what had happened. And then, of course, the scope of the Holocaust and the things they had done really were brought into sharp contrast after the war because, history is written by the victors, and those things were being publicized quite widely. So the public started to learn about horrendous medical experiments that were conducted by the Nazis and, of course, the death camps themselves, the Holocaust itself. And those war crimes trials were an attempt to understand how, quote unquote, normal Germans could do these things. And if you remember what, the takeaway for many people from the Nuremberg trials was many of the people who were directly responsible for the deaths of millions of people gave answers like, I was simply following orders, right? I was doing what I was told. And that was just shocking to the world. One of the big things that came out of the Nuremberg trials was that is no longer considered a defense for a war crime. After Nuremberg, if you're given a direct order that is, even in the military setting, that tells you to commit a war crime, you are still held responsible for that after the fact. Potentially, you can be. So this idea of I was just following orders was sort of thrown out the window as a defense for things that are considered atrocities. There were also other examples of unethical behaviors in quote-unquote research that have been conducted. One of the most glaring examples, one of the most atrocious examples from human history or American history was the Tuskegee syphilis study. This was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service, and it followed 399 low-income African-American men who had syphilis. And the idea was to study the quote-unquote natural course of the illness. Many of the men who had the illness were not given treatment. They were not informed they had syphilis, even though a cure for syphilis, which was antibiotics, had been found at this time. So in a sense, these individuals were allowed to suffer through the effects of syphilis when there was a treatment available. And this was really why this was an ethical violation. The Tuskegee experiment is also another reason why historically African Americans in the United States have some distrust of scientists who are claiming to be treating or addressing medical issues. We're seeing the fallout of this to this day to some degree regarding things like the COVID-19 vaccine. It's sort of this idea that there's an entire aspect of American culture that has been burned in the past by unethical medical practices. And so Tuskegee is really a strong example of that, but there are others as well. So after these types of things came to light and people were made aware of them, what was eventually created was something called the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects on Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Now, that's a mouthful. But what this committee eventually did was develop something called the Belmont Report, which came out in 1979. And the Belmont Report essentially proposed that there should be three basic ethical principles that are applied in protecting human subjects in research. And they detailed these as respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. And let's talk about each of them in a little bit of detail. Respect for persons is essentially treating people as autonomous agents and protecting those that have diminished autonomy, right? So first and foremost, everyone should be considered an end unto themselves, not a means to an end. This is Kant's categorical imperative of ethics. You should never treat anyone as a means to an end. So you want to respect people as individual autonomous agents. And then, of course, if you're doing research on people that have diminished autonomy for some reason, you have a responsibility to protect those subjects. Now, what we mean by diminished autonomy can mean a lot of different things. First and foremost, research on children is a good example. Research on prisoners, research on people with various cognitive deficits of one form or another, like mental retardation, things like that. People who are, considered incompetent by the court, whatever the issue is that diminishes that person's autonomy. What they stated in the Belmont Report was we have a responsibility to protect those individuals and to respect others that have full autonomy. The second principle they put forth in the Belmont Research Report was beneficence. And beneficence literally means, trying to do good, trying to do good towards people, minimizing possible harm and maximizing benefits. So there are two sides to beneficence. We're going to talk in a minute about the concept of non-maleficence, which is sort of the other side of the coin. So beneficence is really literally trying to do good. Non-maleficence is trying not to do bad, right? Either way you look at it, the ultimate goal is that research is supposed to minimize harm and maximize benefit in one form or another. And finally, they presented the idea of justice as an ethical principle. And this means that whatever benefits come from research, whatever positive things come out of it, it should be distributed fairly and equally, equitably throughout the population. So this was sort of a first major national step in establishing a firm report. And as you notice, 1979, not that long ago, right? So this is really a relatively recent development in how we conduct research. There was another development along the way, which is the Department of Health and Human Services and the FDA translated these principles, the Belmont principles, into specific regulations, which they refer to as the Federal Policy for the Protection of Human Subjects. And this was officially adopted in 1991. So these are two early attempts to codify ethics within research and to try and protect human subjects. Now, the American Psychological Association began developing its ethics codes in 1938, and they began work on a formal code in 47, and then the first version of the APA ethics code was established in 1953, and it's been revised multiple times since then, 9 times in fact, most recently in 2002. So we have the APA's Code of Conduct in 2002. The APA's job is to define ethical behavior in psychology, and it's actually quite long and detailed. It contains 151 specific enforceable ethical standards, but they try to sort of narrow this down into what they call their 5 general principles. The APA refers to this as the guidelines for the moral vision of psychologists in research. So only about 15 of these standards are directly related to research and publication. So as you can imagine, many of them are related to clinical work that's conducted as a psychologist. When you have that relationship of a psychologist and a patient, or a client, you have a lot of obligations to not abuse that relationship, the differential power involved in that relationship. And we're not going to delve into many of those as it relates to clinical work, but of these 151, 15 of the standards are very directly related to research, and many others do have implications for how we conduct research in psychology. So we can think of these 5 basic principles that guide all of these enforceable standards as being beneficence and non-maleficence, fidelity and responsibility, integrity, justice, and respect for people's rights and dignity. So let's go through each of these. We already touched on beneficence and non-maleficence. So those are 2 sides of the coin, right? I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Hippocratic Oath that physicians take, the core of which is do no harm. The idea is that the work that we do as psychologists conducting research is intended to benefit those with whom we work and then to do no harm to them. So that's the two sides of that. Fidelity and responsibility is really the idea that psychologists are supposed to operate with certain professional standards of conduct. This includes clarifying your professional roles, having clear boundaries of what it is you're supposed to do and what you're not supposed to do. You're supposed to accept appropriate responsibility in the conduct of research and then seek to manage conflicts of interest. So really, fidelity and responsibility is about professionalism for the most part. Another is integrity. This kind of goes back to the essence of how we conduct science, right? The goal here is to not to create dogma, but to strive towards truth. And so in doing so, we have to exercise integrity in how we practice research. That means things like promoting accuracy, honesty, and truthfulness. The reason this principle is applied to unethical behavior in research is often things like manipulating data, misreporting data, or misrepresenting research that exists in the field in a way that serves some political or personal objective rather than the pursuit of knowledge. The fourth one I want to talk about is justice, which is that we recognize as psychologists that all persons should be able to benefit from psychology's contributions, and they should have equal access to the quality of services that are available. So whatever we develop or come up with out of psychology research, however we disseminate that information, whether it's just letting the public know what we found, or in the form of changes to treatment or intervention or policy, it should benefit everyone in a fair and equal way. And then finally, there's one that's at the end here that can sometimes overlap a little bit with the others. So I want to try and clarify that, and that's respect for people's rights and dignity. Ultimately, you could say that, treating people as autonomous agents and trying to not harm them or let them benefit from research is also respect for their dignity. But ultimately, it's a clear focus on having respect for the worth of all people and their rights to privacy, confidentiality, and self-determination. As I'm sure many of you are aware, in clinical psychology, confidentiality is a really important ethical principle, that we maintain people's privacy. And that's for many, many reasons, but most importantly, so that they feel comfortable sharing intimate details about their life with someone. So they can be honest and candid about what's going on. In research, we have similar responsibilities to protect people's information, to not reveal information about them that's identifiable, that can be connected to them as an individual. We can report overall findings, but we don't identify particular subjects in the process. We take really special care to protect the rights of those that are in vulnerable groups, of course, too, right? So going back to what we mentioned in the Belmont report, if there's someone that has some sort of compromised autonomy for one reason or another, like children who are, not considered to be able to give consent on their own, or people with certain types of deficits that diminish their ability to give consent, or to be manipulated, or their chances of being manipulated are increased, then we have to take special protection to make sure that they're not being exploited in some way or another. Now, your text kind of doesn't follow perfectly along with these 5 APA principles. What they really do is try to break this down into 3 principles of research ethics, and there's going to be some connection to the APA's 5 general principles in each of these. Okay, so the way your book breaks it down is achieving valid results, maintaining professional integrity, and protecting research participants. So we're going to go through each of these in a little bit of detail. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about achieving valid results. And you might think of this as being connected to principle B, which is the fidelity and responsibility principle. So the pursuit of knowledge should always be the goal, right? This is going back to practicing good science and good empiricism. Opinions and biases are to be minimized and to not impact the results. We let the data tell us what it actually tells us without trying to manipulate or influence those outcomes. So psychologists cannot really ethically justify the resources required for the study unless something is learned about human behavior. Even if you conduct a study that is essentially harmless, right, that's not going to cause anybody any distress or any problems, but it simply wastes their time and their effort, that is considered unethical to some degree. So you really need to justify the resources that are being expended upon the study itself. Milgram has a quote here that's also in your text where he talked about obedience. And he said, obedience is the psychological mechanism that links individual action to political purpose. It is the dispositional cement that binds men to systems of authority. For many persons, obedience may be a deeply ingrained behavior tendency. Obedience may also be ennobling and educative and refer to acts of charity and kindness as well as destruction. So the reason why this is included is this idea that Milgram is really learning something in his research about obedience, and that is in many ways how he justified the study. As I mentioned before, it was very controversial. So he's making his case about the validity and the importance of his study. And this quote is often followed by a quote from Baumrind in 1964 that contests the external validity of Milgram's study. Baumrind was a vocal critic of Milgram, and they had many debates back and forth between them, some of them public, about the research. She asserted that the study of obedience to authority in a laboratory was too artificial. So she essentially said, yes, this is an interesting study, but it really doesn't justify the potential risk to the participants because it's not the way things really happen in the real world. So she essentially questioned the external validity of his findings. By designing this lab experiment to test authority, she questioned the value of the outcome that did really apply to how obedience to authority worked in the real world. Milgram essentially made his case regarding validity and the importance of what he learned by saying that, we are coming to an understanding of how people can do awful things. So what's really interesting about Milgram's study, and we'll talk about this again in more detail, is he did not expect the results that he found, and it was informative and enlightening for him as well. He didn't just confirm what his expectations were, he was kind of shocked by the outcome as well. But as you'll see in our further discussion of his article, he really kind of got called on the carpet to defend whether or not his research was valid and ethical specifically. So the second ethical principle that your book discusses is maintaining professional integrity, and this is very closely linked to the APA's principle of integrity, Principle C. So scientists must be open in detailing their method of study and honest in reporting their results. We must conduct ourselves professionally and honestly. This really allows others to assess the validity of the study. If we massage, if we eliminate or hold back certain things, if we're not honest in our reporting, then people cannot honestly evaluate that research. So publication plays a vital role in how this works, right? You have to not only publish your results and your interpretations, but as we mentioned, the whole process takes place in the public. It's all open to skeptical questioning. You essentially have to give your methods. You have to talk exactly about how you got your participants and exactly what you did in great detail so that people can get in there and look at whether every aspect of it is ethical. Milgram is very transparent with his methodology and his results. He does provide very explicit detail in the article, as you'll see. And what was interesting about this professional relationship between he and Baumrind was that they went back and forth in scientific journals and really had these intellectual discussions about the ethics of his research and the validity of his research. And there was a commitment on both their parts to really get in there and to not be dogmatic, but listen to one another and to have a serious discussion about whether or not his research was ethical. And it was done publicly in journal articles. So openness about research procedures and results really goes hand in hand with honesty in your design as well, with being straightforward in how you design your research studies. So the third one that your book discusses that we're going to kind of break down into its subsequent parts is protecting research participants. So this is very closely tied to the principle A of beneficence and non-maleficence in this case. So the most important ethical principle, it really is protecting the research participants. No amount of knowledge to be gained is worth harming people unnecessarily. So we're going to go through each of these in detail, but we're going to talk about avoid harming research participants. This is standard 3.04. Obtaining informed consent, and we'll talk about what that means. This is related to a couple of standards, 3.10, 8.02 through 8.06 in the APA Ethics Code. Avoiding deception in research except in limited circumstances. That's a really important except right there. And again, we're going to go into these in detail. And then finally, maintaining privacy and confidentiality. So let's touch on each of these in more detail. So we're supposed to avoid harming our research participants. We should consider both physical and psychological harm. Okay. The general idea is that participants in a psychology research study should generally not be subjected to harm beyond everyday levels, right? That is a very vague and subjective description, but ultimately the idea is that it shouldn't be extraordinary. Milgram followed up with his participants to ensure that they were not harmed. This was something that he did that not a lot of people know about the study who are just, familiar with it in a superficial way. He actually did a significant amount of debriefing and follow up with his participants. 83.7% of those participants, now granted, small study, 40 participants only, about 84% of them indicated they were very glad or glad they had participated in the study after they'd been debriefed. Again, Baumrind was very critical of him, and she basically said the 16% that were not glad, how were they affected? How were they impacted? We know that people don't generally like to be misled, and those that have been misled in a study will sometimes then have a distrust for authority that can, ripple effect out into the world. Students generally have some pretty strong opinions about the possible harm in the Milgram experiment, and a really important thing about it is we're seeing it through an important lens. We're seeing it through the modern lens, not the lens of when it was conducted in the 60s. We have very different thoughts now about ethics, but generally speaking, there's concern that by using deception, you're not just potentially harming the individual because of the study itself, but you're also harming their relationship and their trust in science going forward. Another very famous study that's related to ethics in psychology is the Zimbardo research, sometimes also called the Stanford Prison Experiment. It was conducted in 1973. It was published in 1973 by Zimbardo, Haney, Banks. Haney, Banks, and Zimbardo was the order of the authors on that. This is a famous prison experiment that was conducted with students, with male students at Stanford. The researchers asked young male volunteers to be randomly assigned to act either as prisoners or guards in a study of how social position affected behavior. Within the first 2 days, they found that there were dramatic changes in people's behavior that were unexpected. Prisoners started to become passive and disorganized. They started to show some real negative mental health effects from, this was an extended study that took place over a period of time, over a few days. It was supposed to go on for 2 weeks was the original plan, right? But within 2 days, they were already seeing some mental health deterioration on both sides. The prisoners were, again, becoming very passive and disorganized. The guards actually started to become abusive very quickly, the guards, people assigned to serve as guards. The study was actually halted after 6 days because of what happened, instead of the planned 2 weeks, to avoid harming participants. So as controversial as Zimbardo's research was, in a certain sense, they did the right thing. They stepped in and stopped the experiment. They had a special post-experiment debriefing and discussion, which really, according to their study, really seemed to alleviate participant stress. Like once everyone had gone through that process of being debriefed and had an opportunity to talk about their feelings and how they were impacted, most people reported they didn't experience any significant harm. Many social scientists, ethicists, and others have concluded that Milgram's procedures did not harm the subjects. It's controversial. Again, we see it through a modern lens, but essentially, the consensus amongst experts in the field was that it didn't really harm the subjects, and therefore it was justified because it produced some really important knowledge about obedience to authority. Not everyone agrees with this. There's not a full consensus. Another thing to consider is that well-intentioned researchers can often really fail to foresee all the potential problems. As I said, Milgram was surprised by the outcome of his study. Zimbardo and his colleagues were surprised about these dramatic changes they saw in the behavior of the participants, which is why they stopped the study after 6 days. Arthur Miller, the famous playwright who wrote The Crucible and The Iceman, Death of a Salesman, excuse me. He stated that the real harm could result from not doing research on destructive obedience. He was actually in favor of research like Stanley Milgram's because he thought it was important for us to understand troubling human behavior. I think it's, again, the context is really important. The world was altered by World War II in a way that we can never really grasp or get a handle on, having not lived through it. But it shook a lot of people to their core in terms of their belief about what humanity was capable of. And many people, took the message of World War II and especially the Holocaust to this idea of never again, right? We need to prevent this from happening ever again. And in order to do so, we've got to understand how it happened in the first place. So that's the justification that many make behind doing research like that conducted by Stanley Milgram or Zimbardo and his colleagues. The second sort of subset of protecting research participants is to obtain informed consent. And I want to really detail what I mean by informed consent. So there are a few basic principles behind this. First and foremost, the participants must be competent. So competent is actually a legal term. In psychology, in clinical psychology in particular, we often talk about capacity. As a clinician, especially working in geriatrics, I'll often have someone consult me and say, does this patient have capacity to make medical decisions? Does this patient have capacity to decide whether or not they should have a certain procedure or surgery, for example, to undergo chemotherapy? You know, people that have dementia, that have cognitive impairment, there are questions about what they fully understand and are they making informed decisions. Now that's capacity, and capacity can wax and wane. But competency is more of a legal term. What it really means ultimately is, has a person been deemed by the court to be incompetent, meaning that they can't make decisions for themselves. They need some sort of guardian in place. We're using the term competent here a little more generally. It's not the strict legal definition, but what it ultimately means is, does the person have the capability? Do they have the intellectual, cognitive ability to make decisions for themselves? Now, once we determine that they do, their participation has to be fully voluntary, and we'll talk about what that means in terms of fully voluntary. There can't be coercion, essentially, is what it comes down to. The person can't be pressured. They have to do this fully of their own volition. They have to be fully informed. That's one of the terms there in informed consent, right? The person has to understand as much as they need to understand the research and to know what they're getting into. We're going to talk in a minute about what that means in terms of utilizing deception in research. So you always need to make sure the person is able to comprehend, right? So that doesn't mean that they necessarily are unable to comprehend the simple details. It might be how it's explained to them. Is it done in this like overly technical way, or is it somewhat misleading or vague in its description? So people need to know what they're getting into, with a couple of limitations and exceptions we're going to talk about in a moment. You always need to be provided with an informed consent document in a research study. There should be a physical, usually there's a physical piece of paper that you're handed that is very clear about what you are committing to, what you're agreeing to do, what your rights and responsibilities are. It should be an unambiguous, non-technical language that can be understood by the average participant. It's much longer and potentially more difficult for participants to understand. If it's really long and complicated, then that can make it hard. It should usually fit on one page, right? The length can make it difficult for the person to know whether or not they want to participate, because it can just be too much of a chore to read through pages and pages and pages of technical jargon. So it should be pretty straightforward and pretty simple. In some cases, we find that deception may be necessary. And we'll talk about why that is and when it's appropriate, when it's considered ethical. If you do utilize deception up front, you're not going to inform the person, right? By definition, you're deceiving them. You are misleading them in some way. And if you do that, you then have an obligation to provide what's called a detailed debriefing after the study is complete. A debriefing is essentially explaining what the study was really about, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. Keep in mind that some people may not have the capacity to consent, as I've described. Children, for example, can only assent, which means agreeing, but it's not considered a legal term. It's not formal. They need to have a parent or a legal guardian who technically gives consent. The child can give assent to participate. Those are kind of, that's not splitting hairs, but that is a technical distinction between the two. There are also special protections for people like prisoners, pregnant women, mentally disabled, those that are educationally or economically disadvantaged in some way. So we need to be very careful that the person is capable of consenting to the research study. There's some examples in early research, especially in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, of people really not getting consent from individuals that would never pass an institutional review board today. They would be regarded as unethical studies. So another subtype of avoiding harm to participants is to avoid deception in research, except in limited circumstances. And let's talk about those limited circumstances. In some cases, because of what we're studying, deception may be necessary. Participants may not behave in their normal ways if they know what the researchers are studying. When we talk about Milgram's study, we're going to go into this in more detail. But as you can imagine, if when the participant walks through the door, they were told everything about the study with no deception, the study doesn't work. It doesn't accurately measure what it's trying to look at. So you are required to do a debriefing if there's any deception at all in your study. And sometimes the deception is not so clever or so obvious as it is in Milgram's study. Sometimes you just kind of you want to avoid what are called demand characteristics. You don't want the person to sort of tell you what you want to hear. So you have to withhold things or leave things out of the initial consent process. And then after the fact, you say, okay, actually what we're really studying is this. Let me explain why we had deception and why it was included. So the debriefing should explain the true nature of the experiment after it's completed, after they've had the opportunity to provide data, and it should also explain why deception was incorporated in the first place. So Milgram asserted very strongly that the deception was absolutely necessary. He said the central moral justification for allowing my experiment is that it was judged acceptable by those who took part in it. When we get into his study in more detail, we'll explore this as well. There's also some other examples from your book. Aronson and Mills in 1959 did a study on the severity of initiations to groups. What they found was that it didn't pose a greater than everyday risk to subjects, but it did use deception. And then afterwards, they found that none of them expressed any resentment or annoyance at having been misled. So that's what you kind of want to see in a study that involves deception. Hopefully after the debriefing process, you kind of want your participants to have a eureka moment and say, oh, okay, now I understand why there was deception. I get it. In some cases, it can strike you as quite clever. I've certainly participated in research studies when I was an undergrad where after the fact I was like, oh, that's really genius how they did that so they could still study this thing without me knowing what it was going in, and therefore I gave honest and sort of accurate responses. Another subset of avoiding harm is to maintain privacy and confidentiality of participants. This also needs to be detailed in the informed consent document. So the person is informed in advance how their privacy and confidentiality is going to be protected. We do things like locking filing cabinets. We use codes instead of names as identifiers for participants. The only place their name likely will appear is on the consent document. And then after that, there's a process of hiding their identity through some randomly assigned number or identifier. Keeping in mind that research records can be subpoenaed, right? Just like progress notes for therapists can be subpoenaed. So confidentiality does not apply in public places or for public records. So if we're doing observational research where we're not manipulating anything and we're just going out to public place and observing people's behavior, we don't always necessarily need their consent for that because we're not identifying them in any way, and these are things they're doing in public. If we're doing archival research and we're pulling things that are part of the public record, we also don't have as much of an obligation to maintain confidentiality if it's already a matter of public record. In some cases, you will actually issue someone a certificate of confidentiality. This sort of protects the researchers from having to release their records. The only exceptions are things like becoming aware of any child abuse or neglect or abuse of an elderly person. There are reasons why even a certificate of confidentiality can be violated by the court. I'm sure many of you are familiar with HIPAA, which is a law that was passed a few years ago that governs how we utilize medical information and protect records. They have what's called the Final Privacy Rule, which was codified in 1996, and it applies to healthcare data. Many people who are, refusing to wear masks in public places lately misunderstand HIPAA and how that relates. They think that it means they don't have to divulge their any sort of disability they may have. That's not how HIPAA works. It's actually not how the ADA works either. But ultimately, HIPAA is about the responsibility of researchers and medical and hospital practices to protect people's data, their healthcare data, from being identified. So we have to have valid authorization for disclosing any health information. So there is a system in place in virtually every research setting, no matter where you're conducting research, either through a company or through a university. There are always institutional review boards. Hospitals have their own institutional review boards for research, that kind of thing. But part of federal policy requires that all institutions, especially those that seek federal funding, have to have an IRB or institutional review board in place. The IRB is a committee of people whose job it is to review the proposal of a research study before it's conducted. This is something that has to happen before you go forward. And they essentially want to apply ethical standards that are set by federal regulations and look at the specific proposed study and say, yes or no, this study is in line with the requirements for ethical practice and research. Sometimes they'll ask for adjustments rather than dismissing it out of hand. They'll say, well, we're okay with this study if you change X, Y, and Z. There are certain aspects that we find in violation potentially of ethical standards. But it's basically, they're a gatekeeper, and their job is essentially to try and protect research participants and to make sure that we're not practicing in an unethical way. Now, one of the things that's interesting about IRBs is that they're not constituted entirely by other researchers, right? We're trying to, again, reduce the possibility of bias. So regulations require that IRBs have a diverse membership, people from various fields, members who have no stake in the institution. They have to have at least 5 members so that if there is a vote, there's an odd number usually is required for tie breaking, but there needs to be at least one non-scientist on every institutional review board, and there needs to be at least one member who is not from the institution, who has no affiliation, who's essentially from the community. In some cases, this can be the same individual, right? The reason why we want to have a non-scientist or a person with no affiliation is, again, to reduce bias. As you can imagine, a room full of psychology researchers may have a very strong investment in the search for knowledge for its own sake. They might be more willing to accept certain risks in order to gain important knowledge. You want someone in the room who's going to apply a community standard without that sort of lens altering their perception of things. You want someone who's a non-scientist who's simply saying, as a human being who understands the proposal, I have some issues with this or I don't. And then, of course, you want people who are not associated with the institution. You don't want there to be internal pressure to approve research. You don't want there to be, a lot of times these research studies, especially in things like drug studies or treatments for cancer, this can have really important financial impact. If you develop a new drug that treats cancer or a COVID-19 vaccine, for example, there's a lot of money to be made there, and therefore there can be a lot of influence or pressure to violate ethical standards. So you want someone who's from the outside, who's not connected to that institution, who has no vested interest in approving that research. IRBs themselves are also monitored by a federal agency called the Office for Protection from Research Risks. It's part of the National Institute of Health, or the NIH. The only exception to this is when you're doing research that involves pharmaceuticals, and then it becomes the responsibility of the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Most IRBs require that researchers complete a training program about human subjects. The most common one is the Collaborative Institutional Training Initiative, or CITI, which was produced by the University of Miami. You can go to that homepage here on the link if you'd like to. So this is one way in which we can make sure that everyone who's conducting research at that institution has a basic level of education about the ethics associated with research on human subjects. Basically, an IRB's job is to ensure that minimal standards are met, that we're minimizing risk to subjects, that the risk to subjects are reasonable in relation to anticipated benefits. This is not to say that every study has to be entirely benign, right? Have no potential for risk at all. There are some situations where a certain amount of risk is acceptable and reasonable because of the potential gain, right? So if the anticipated benefits are strong enough, then we may be willing to accept a certain amount of risk to subjects. But again, those subjects would need to have full informed consent. They would have to understand the risk they are undertaking. Even in an approved study, they have to then give consent to participate. And another reason why IRBs are there are to make sure that subjects are selected in an equitable fashion. Again, trying to reduce bias, trying to maintain justice, and see that everyone has an opportunity to benefit from the research. They sometimes apply what's called the final rule, which is also sometimes called the common rule. This is sort of a modernization of the oversight system, but what the final rule essentially says is that it's strengthening the protections for people who volunteer to participate in research while ensuring that the oversight system doesn't add inappropriate administrative burdens, particularly to low-risk research. So the common rule, the final rule, is really focusing on making it so that IRBs don't prevent us from conducting research, but that they also make sure we're meeting minimum ethical standards at best. They included a new term in the development of the final rule called broad consent. This is about addressing the question of how we store or maintain information and collected information from research studies. Broad consent statements must be included in the informed consent document, and it allows the subject to say no if they have any issues regarding storage, maintenance, and secondary uses of their information. If you say we're going to store information in this fashion, the person feels that's not secure enough, they need to have an opportunity to drop out of the study based upon that. If that information is going to be shared or passed along to subsequent researchers or disseminated to federal agencies or something like that, that also needs to be included in the consent process. So this is a figure from your book. This comes from the CITY program developed at the University of Miami, and these are the 5 factors that are included in the final rule. The 5 elements at the beginning of an informed consent process and included in the consent form that would encompass the key information that the person needs to know to give informed consent. They need to understand, of course, that consent is being sought for research and that their participation is voluntary. This is what we're asking you to do, and we're going through an informed consent process. They need to know the purpose of the research, the expected duration of their participation, and what procedures are going to be followed in the research. They need to understand reasonable and foreseeable risks or discomfort that they may undergo as part of their participation. They need to know the potential benefits that may be expected from the research. Why are we conducting it, right? Ethically, it needs to have the potential to gain something. Otherwise, even if it's harmless, it's a waste of time and resources. And then, of course, they need to know appropriate alternative procedures or courses of treatment that might be advantageous to them. So if there's an alternative thing they could do that doesn't involve participating in this study and they still get some benefit, they need to know there are other options. The way this plays out sometimes in research in universities is you're given other opportunities to earn credit for things like SONA. So if you go to participate in a study, you read the consent form and you say, I don't think this is for me, they have to offer you some sort of alternative way of obtaining, for example, extra credit or some sort of credit for that process. So let's talk about conclusions here for a moment. We utilize an ethical lens in developing and conducting research to protect people. We also want to protect the integrity of science and how it's used and how it's analyzed. So it's not just about ethically protecting individuals, it's about ethically protecting the practice of empiricism. The scientific community, via these policies and regulations, we're trying to foster ethical conduct in research. Especially if you're receiving federal funding, you have to undergo a structured institutional review board review before you can then conduct your research. You cannot start your research until you've got your IRB approval. And so for many people conducting research, that's a stumbling block that has to be completed before you can begin. And this is really a safeguard for all parties. This is not just to protect the individuals who are participating. It's meant to protect the researchers from potential litigation or accusations of misconduct down the road. It's also meant to protect the institution. And these guiding ethical principles are used for education, for IRBs, for peer reviews, but the final component in this ethics process is the researchers and their team, right? It inevitably falls on the shoulders of those conducting the research to make sure that they're behaving in an ethical way. Questions regarding deception, informed consent, capacity, debriefing, and judgment are all addressed, and these things all need to be part of the process in developing any research study before you start doing a single thing, right? Before you start conducting any interactions whatsoever with a participant, you need to address all of these ethical concerns. In our next lecture, we're going to review Stanley Milgram's article in a lot of detail, and I think that will allow us to touch on several of these ethical principles that came up in the chapter.